All right, welcome everyone. We're gonna give people a few more seconds to log in, about a minute actually, and then we'll get started. All right, let's get rolling. So hello everyone, thank you for being here. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to another webinar in our Green Infrastructure webinar series. Today's session is going to be Equitable Green Infrastructure in a Changing Climate. My name is Shannon Pepper. I'm with the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be your host for this and other webinars in the series. This series is made possible with funding from the US EPA under a grant aimed at helping rural, small, and tribal communities and wastewater treatment systems access funding. The goal here is compliance with the Clean Water Act to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution in our shared waters. We're also getting programmatic support from a really great Albuquerque-based coalition called Arid LID. So before we begin, I'm going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be able to use and access the control panel. That will be on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the webinar recording and other information that you may need. You can also go ahead and download the slides from today as well as the series flyer in the handout tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. Slides will also contain URLs to the resources that we discussed during the presentation today. On the screen here are some instructions for how to open the control panel. So if you haven't used this before, can take a minute to explore your options there in the control panel. Okay. So this webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you have to attend the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. So certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date automatically. If you have questions or need assistance, please go ahead and contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now, just for a little bit about us, the Environmental Finance Center Network, of which my organization, the Southwest EFC, is part of, provides training and technical assistance to small water, wastewater, and stormwater systems in all US states and territories through our capacity building programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water, wastewater, or stormwater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which Joni will share in the chat. So that will be the EFC Network Get Help link. Also, if you're interested in viewing past EFCN webinar recordings, you can go ahead and subscribe to the EFCN YouTube channel. That link Joni will also drop in the chat. I would like to introduce our presenters for today. Again, I'm Shannon Pepper. I'm a research scientist with the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. Dany Garcia Moreno is a climate resilience planner with Anthropocene Alliance. In her diverse professional experience, she's focused on collaborative, community-based action and stakeholder engagement. Carson Risner is a senior research analyst with Earth Economics, where he specializes in making a business case for conservation and nature-based solutions projects by integrating the value of nature within cost-benefit analyses, performing environmental equity analyses, and reviewing environmental policy. And my colleague Joni Palmer will be running the chat and the polls, and will also be helping field questions for our speakers today. So speaking of that, we would like to hear a little bit more about all of you. Could you please complete the poll that pops up on your screen? Joni's going to go ahead and launch that poll now. Okay, so that poll is in progress. We're collecting our responses. Looks like about 70% of you have voted at this point. If you haven't completed, go ahead and make sure you complete that poll. Awesome, thanks everyone for contributing. Okay, Joni, let's give it another maybe 5 seconds and then we can close that poll.
Okie dokie. All right, closing the poll, and I'm going to share the results. So here's who's in the room. This is so we've got the majority of you are planners, designers, and engineers, followed by public works folks, and then elected officials and policy, then management, and then citizens and community groups. So thanks all for joining us.
Awesome, thank you all. Yeah, it does give us a good sense of who's coming to these webinars to know who you are and what your role is. Okay. So before we launch into our guest speakers presentations, I'm going to go over very quickly the bare basics of green infrastructure as it relates to water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. So if this is the first webinar in the series that you're attending, please know that you can also view the full version of our first webinar, which is called Green Infrastructure 101. That was already recorded a few months ago, and it's now hosted on the EFCN website and on YouTube. So for those of you who are returning today, I will keep this very brief, just a few slides. So what makes green infrastructure such a compelling water management option for communities of all sizes? Well, when thinking about the words water infrastructure, a lot of people associate to things like pipes, concrete lined drainage ditches, or treatment plants. These are infrastructure assets made primarily from concrete and steel materials. So then what are we talking about when we talk about the green part? What do we mean by green? There's not really a universally agreed on definition for green, and for the purposes of this series, I'll break it down like this. So with green infrastructure, we're talking about water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure that integrates natural systems. So that could look like a vegetated swale, a rain garden, or a wetland, either constructed or naturally occurring. So natural systems, we're talking about plant growth, the water cycle, soil filtration, these types of processes. Now, from these pictures, it might seem like I'm creating some kind of dichotomy, like green versus gray, but actually in most cases, we advocate using both these types of infrastructure. At least we at the Southwest EFC do, and we need them to work together. So let's look at one example of green and gray infrastructure that share a function but look a bit different on the ground. So here we have concrete sewer pipes whose function is the conveyance of stormwater away from roads and buildings. And its green counterpart is an infiltration trench that could include filtration of the water through soil, allowing plants and fungi in the trench to break down pollutants associated with the adjacent road, like heavy metals and oils and that kind of thing. And this is a feature that the community can enjoy walking along, with plants cooling the air and improving air quality, as well as capturing carbon and other airborne particles. So if you're still feeling confused about what green infrastructure is and what it looks like at different scales, please make sure to watch the first webinar in the series. It's going to give you a more broad overview, more examples of green infrastructure. So let's get into why we're advocating for green infrastructure. We also call this sometimes nature-based solutions. A big reason and why we're here today is because of climate resiliency. So much of our current infrastructure was built with a very different idea of what a 100-year storm might look like. Here in New Mexico, for example, that's going to look like longer periods of drought followed by deluges of precipitation, far outside historical norms on both of those aspects. Much of our aging storm sewer infrastructure is not built to handle these kinds of volumes of water, and we're losing much of that valuable fresh rainwater as runoff. And green infrastructure at all scales can capture, slow, and infiltrate, filter stormwater where it falls. This reduces the burden on wastewater treatment plants and simultaneously improves water quality by treating water before it returns to the sources that we use for drinking. And those are just a couple of benefits of green infrastructure. We're also looking at co-benefits. So these are some key elements to green and natural infrastructure that make it particularly good at managing and treating water in the environment, and which give it a wide range of co-benefits for humans and wildlife both. So these things can look like increased habitat, improved air quality, improved mental health for the community, benefiting your watershed, everyone downstream, bioremediation, so treating water and reducing burden on gray infrastructure and treatment facilities. And green infrastructure can also be cheaper in the long run than building and maintaining gray infrastructure. Now we're also looking at partnerships. So here in the US, in both law and down to the community level, drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems are typically built and managed as separate from one another, right? Even though all water on Earth is part of the same system, which is the water cycle, there's often kind of limited understanding of how to fund and implement green infrastructure because it demands cross-disciplinary, cross-department collaboration in order to be successful. Also, there's a big city bias, but green infrastructure is not just for urban areas. Green infrastructure can address common environmental and public health issues in small, rural, and tribal communities as well. And in some ways, these communities are the most well-suited to green infrastructure projects because often we don't see the same divides between different departments or utilities in small and rural places. People are better used to talking to each other and working together, and that's often one of the biggest hurdles with implementing green infrastructure. So our intention with this webinar series is really just to highlight the ways that effective planning, implementation, and maintenance of green infrastructure demands partnerships across all departments and disciplines. And this requires us as organizers of this series to also look to our colleagues in planning, engineering, policy, landscape architecture, geography, community coalitions, and really the list goes on. And we want to also reach academics, practitioners, and students as well. So here's an overview of our webinar schedule. We're going to be doing these approximately quarterly, so make sure to check back on the EFCN website for updated event pages as we get closer to each webinar release. You can also sign up for email updates at the link that Joni will drop in the chat now. That's going to be the EFCNnetwork.org training events link. So each webinar will be recorded too, so that you can either watch the live or recorded versions of these webinars. The recordings are going to be posted to the event page for each webinar and will also be available on the EFCN YouTube channel. So without further ado, I am going to hand off this presentation now to my colleague, Dany Garcia Moreno from the Anthropocene Alliance. Okay, Dany, you can go ahead and share, turn on your video and unmute.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, everyone, wherever you're calling from. Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to the EFCN for hosting us. I'm really grateful to be included in this conversation and to share more about our work in this space. So yes, my name is Dany. I'm the Climate Resilience Planner with Anthropocene Alliance. We're a national nonprofit supporting community-based organizations in the climate and environmental justice space. So I'm excited to give you an overview of our work and our approach to green infrastructure through an equity lens. So today I'm going to walk you through a little bit about what we do, who we are, where we work, and the types of projects that we support towards achieving a more equitable green infrastructure landscape. So next slide, please. So before we dive in, I want to give you a little bit more background on A2. So we're a national nonprofit. We're founded in 2017. So we're young and small but mighty, and we're growing quickly. We're the largest coalition of frontline communities fighting for climate and environmental justice, and we're very proud of our continuing growth. So this map here shows you the distribution of where all of our members are located. And so as a membership-based organization, our members receive technical assistance in grant writing, grant management, communications, advocacy, and a lot more. And it's completely free to be a member. So all the folks that are joining our coalition are typically small community-based organizations that just need a little bit more support to achieve their goals. Next slide, please. So our mission is to support frontline communities that are impacted by the cumulative impacts of climate change. So that includes flooding, pollution, fire, excessive heat, and the list is growing, as I'm sure you all know. And we do that, as I mentioned, by providing them technical and organizing expertise, grant writing support, and a platform for sharing ideas and experiences. We also aim to educate residents, regulators, and elected officials on the best policies to mitigate environmental harms. Next slide. And so a little bit more about the communities that we work with. So we have 335 members across 46 US states and territories. And we're expanding our membership through the creation of regional hubs. So in every region in the US, we're creating a group where folks can work together and kind of strengthen their own coalitions. 96% of the organizations that we support have organizational leaders that live in the communities that they represent. 72% of the organizations are woman-led. 85% are communities, support communities that are underserved. And 74% support communities that are majority Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so with this sort of demographic, we're really uniquely positioned to work towards equity, and by centering equity in green infrastructure, by really centering the voices of our communities and their work, especially in processes where they've been historically excluded. So next slide. And of course, we don't do any of this work alone. We're a small but mighty team, as I mentioned, of 16 staff. But we're very lucky to be supported by the great work of all of the partner organizations that you see here. There's also more partners that we have, but couldn't include all of them in this slide. But really huge shout out to them. We wouldn't be A2 without our partners. Next slide. And so together with our partners and members, we've been able to achieve, I think, an impressive track record in just the 7 years of being an organization. So in those 7 years, we've been able to secure over $8 million in pro bono services for our members. So this was received across 208 members via A2. And we've also been able to request and support our members in requesting over $76 million in grants and support. This was across 221 members. We're still growing our pro bono and grant writing portfolios, so we really hope and expect this number to keep growing as we continue to support our members' work. Next slide. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about how we structure our work to be focused on environmental justice and equity. So first, to kind of have a little bit of a baseline for our conversation, I want to start with the definition. So we're currently carrying forward the definition that's been set by the Biden administration under the Justice 40 program. And this program identifies environmental justice communities as those that are marginalized by underinvestment and overburdened by pollution. We added this little addendum that's overburdened by pollution and other environmental harms and climate impacts, since we know that those are growing and of course are also having a disproportionate impact on those underinvested communities. And I also have here some of the resources that we use, primarily in grant writing, to provide the data that shows that our communities are EJ communities. So the first one is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CJUST. This provides census tract level data that shows how burdened each tract is compared to others and using percentiles. It's a really cool mapping tool. It's really helpful. It shows many indicators, including climate change, energy, health, legacy pollution, workforce development, and others. The second is the Federal Emergency Management Agency National Risk Index, or FEMA Risk Index. And this is more focused on the natural hazard side of things. So it displays an index that combines the expected loss experienced in a community with social vulnerability and community resilience to show a relative risk index across 18 different natural hazards. And this also gives you an option to display county or census tract view. And the third is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tool, or the EJ Screen. And this is a data set that combines environmental and socioeconomic indicators. It's very rich and also provides census tract level data. It allows you to customize the data with additional demographics from the US Census. And it allows you to create reports for various levels of like municipalities or city, county, etc. So definitely check those out if you haven't. There's lots of resources available on all of these tools, so I'd be happy to talk more about those. Next slide. And while we leverage all those tools to make a more compelling argument for grant applications, we also, of course, like to focus on the lived experiences of our community members. And so this graph here shows the primary concerns that the members are facing in their communities. And as you can see, the biggest concern that our members have, or the biggest issue that they're dealing with, is flooding. And you can see, of course, the other kind of expected climate impacts, climate environmental justice impacts. So heat is the next one, hurricanes and tropical storms, which of course also contribute to the flooding. There's also erosion, drought, and wildfires. But I think flooding has been especially the main point of focus for our green infrastructure work. So we'll take a closer look at the work in that space. Next slide. So how exactly do we combine all of these lived experiences, tools, resources, partnerships to produce impactful community change? Well, at A2, we like to focus on community-led projects and community-focused support. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples today across all of these categories. So we'll be focusing on our mutual aid, our community engagement organizing efforts, capacity building, and how we support projects from planning to implementation. Next slide. So first, as a sort of baseline and lifeline of support for our members, we have a mutual aid fund that serves, as a safety net almost for our impacted communities. So when a community is impacted or is expecting to be impacted by a disaster, they can apply for the fund and receive up to $4,000 in aid to either prepare and kind of weather the storm or recover after the disaster. So this can be used for a lot of different things. So if you need to evacuate and need hotel or other emergency housing to be safe during a storm, or if you need a generator to be able to stay in your home, drinking water, if you need to clean up and sanitize your home, the list kind of goes on. So this is entirely a donation-based program. So if you can and would like to donate, I would definitely encourage that. So next slide. Beyond this sort of lifeline support, we're also interested in building the strength in numbers that is required to make impactful change within our communities. And we do so through community engagement and organizing. So in this slide here, you see two sort of categories of that. So on the left is an example of one of our advocacy campaigns. And those are some of our members using the A2 advocacy merchandise. So this was a campaign around flooding and voting. So we made a list of demands for some of our members, and they went out with the advocacy merch and demanded like decreased flood insurance or just buyouts. The demands are really community specific, and I can give you more examples of that if you would like. But that's a great way to kind of get the word out about the concerns that those communities are facing and kind of rally support, and hopefully inspire the elected officials to make a difference. And on the right picture, you see community organizing training. This one took place in New Orleans, Louisiana. We had 6 of these in-person trainings with Acorn International. They're a community organizing nonprofit that we've partnered with. And these trainings were focused on how to build a successful campaign and traditional organizing techniques like door knocking or distributing flyers and things like that to build support for a community organization. So next slide. We also do more capacity building, both on like a project scale and through forums and trainings. So this slide again is kind of separated into 2. So to the left, you see the building community capacity for resilience planning. So these are materials that we are using for a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation project that's supporting 10 communities in the Atlantic coast and 10 communities in the Great Lakes to do capacity building for coastal resilience. So this includes recruiting people to join their organization, getting support from A2 and our partners to build a resilience roadmap that identifies the risks, the primary risks that they're dealing with, and certain opportunities, green infrastructure opportunities especially, that they might leverage to address those risks. And the goal is to produce a roadmap for each of the 20 communities participating in this project to be able to apply for future funding. So this is really just setting the baseline to take their project kind of to the next level and the next stage. And then to the right, we have 2 ongoing series where members come together and share best practices or share their experiences, or also learn from presenters, as is kind of in the similar webinar format. So the first and top one is the A2 forums. So these meet about bi-weekly, and they're an opportunity, like I said, to just connect, meet other members that might be dealing with the same issues, and share experiences, answer each other's questions, share resources. And we also host presenters, so like I said, so about 3 years ago, we had Earth Economics to do a workshop on how to apply for FEMA funds. So we'd really try to make these relevant to funding opportunities and comment periods, et cetera, so that our members can make the most of those. We're also hosting a green infrastructure, our own green infrastructure training series. And this is a 12 workshop series that is aimed at training community-based organizations with the tools and resources to be able to pursue their own green infrastructure projects in their communities. So these are, our audience in this case is primarily organizations that have either secured funding, are seeking funding, or have not yet successfully secured funding, so have applied for and have maybe been rejected. So we're really just, trying to build their knowledge base and the tools that they can access to make a more compelling project, that community-led compelling project. So the EFCN's very own Dr. Joni Palmer presented our first Green Infrastructure 101, and we've partnered with a lot of really exciting organizations to host the remaining sessions. So if you would like to watch any of these sessions, they're all recorded and they're all available on our YouTube. And on our YouTube, we also have, I think, the largest collection of flood videos in the United States. So it's really fascinating to, see the effort that goes around in the community to capture their impacts to be able to make a change. So next slide. And finally, we also aim to support projects across their lifetime, so from planning really to implementation. And today I bring you an example of a flood mitigation project in Reedsville, Georgia. And Reedsville is a small rural community. So this really exemplifies that idea that green infrastructure is well suited across any type of community. So it's a small rural community, and Miss Jackie, who you see there in the pink, approached us requesting help with severe flooding that she was experiencing on her property. She had been flooding for a really long time, and the floodwaters sometimes got up to her windowsill. And she had tried to do something about it, but was met with red tape and just bureaucracy. And so we mobilized to try to support her. And so in 2021, we received a grant to look at property level flooding and do analysis both in Reedsville and a neighboring community named Collins, Georgia, and try to get a better understanding of why this flooding was happening. We used the findings from that grant to apply to an additional opportunity and received a grant in 2022 to assess the problem at a more regional level scale. We contracted with an engineering firm named Sherwood Engineers, who did a fantastic job, and they produced a regenerative landscape plan to mitigate the flooding. And as a part of that, we did a lot of community engagement to really try to understand from the residents' perspectives what was happening, where did they think the problem was coming from, and also just get ideas on what they would like the solution to look like. In 2024, we received the Community Change Grant, Equitable Resilience Technical Assistance, and we leveraged that to take that engineering work kind of to the next level. And that's the picture here that you see on the bottom right. The technical assistance provider was really able to take that engineering work and produce just these beautiful designs that turned into this community-led vision to mitigate flooding. So next slide, please. So here you see that vision. So these are the renditions. Both on the bottom right is the engineering design, and that bigger image is the rendition of what the stormwater park would look like. So this is a stormwater detention park that's meant to provide both a community space for gathering and outdoor recreation, but also mitigate that flooding. And it would ultimately mitigate flooding across 130 homes. So this really would be an impactful project for this small community. We're currently working on securing funding for the final design and permitting, and really I think this project exemplifies the importance of partnerships. This really wouldn't have been possible without the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who produced some hydrological modeling for us, as well as Sherwood, who did a fantastic job on the engineering, and SMM, the technical assistance provider, who really made this vision come to life. And of course, none of this would have been possible without our fearless leader, Miss Jackie. And you can read more about her in the story that we published in the U.S. News and World Report. Next slide, please. So I hope that from learning about our work, that you feel inspired to create change in your own communities. And I'll sort of leave you with some of the key takeaways that I've learned from my time at A2. And hopefully you can implement them in your own equity-focused practices. So first and foremost, I would say that it's so important to listen and learn. Each community has a story, and each community is eager to share that story to those that want to listen and help. And there's so many lessons that can be implemented into more successful projects from those stories. Number two, I would say, is meet communities where they are. No two community-based organizations are going to be the same. So knowing what resources each community needs after having listened to their stories is really going to make for more successful collaborations and more successful projects. I would say number three is to be an ally and to be an advocate. It's so important to take the listening and the learning and the meeting those communities where they are, to take those lessons and recognize what the community needs and what the community wants, and try to advocate for those solutions. At the end of the day, the community members are the ones who know their context the best. So being able to be a champion for those is really important. Finally, I would say lean on partnerships and on existing resources. I think I've hopefully done a good job of showing how important it is to have people that are supporting your work. And I really like the saying that says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And I think A2 and the work that we've been able to accomplish so far really encapsulates that really well. So that's all I have for y'all today. Thank you so much for listening. And I hope this has been helpful in guiding your own equity-focused green infrastructure work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dany. That was awesome. So I think also what I would like to do at this point is just open up another poll, and I imagine that after listening to Dany talk about some of the really specific work that Anthropocene Alliance is doing, maybe you have some thoughts or questions, and you can go ahead and type any questions that you have into the questions box at any time, and we can address them later in the presentation. But also, I would like to know from all of you, or anyone who's willing to answer, what is the top environmental justice, or EJ, we can sometimes call it, priority or issue related to stormwater and wastewater in your community or a community that you're working with? So maybe take a second to just think about what that priority or issue might be. Since we have attendees today from all over the place, we'd like to just gather up a little bit more information about different places and what kinds of issues they're facing. So if you can also provide a little bit of geographical context in your response, like where you are located and where your work is, that would be really helpful. So if you have any responses, you can go ahead and type them into the chat. So again, in that control panel on the right-hand side, there's that chat tab, and you can type your response in that chat box. And while you're doing that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our next speaker. We've got Carson Risner from Earth Economics. He'll be talking about how to make a business case for green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So Carson, you can go ahead and turn on your camera and unmute, and I'll let you take it over.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shannon. Hello, everyone. My name is Carson Risner. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, speak about our work, what we do, and potentially educate and maybe help some people out in terms of figuring out how to get nature-based solutions or green infrastructure implemented in your community as well. So a little bit about myself. I'm a senior research analyst at Earth Economics. Primarily, I conduct ecosystem service analyses to communicate the value of nature and nature-based solutions. These analyses are commonly used to integrate the value provided by nature into decision-making frameworks, such as benefit cost analyses. Too often, the natural environment is thought of as an accessory rather than an essential system, and this leads to degradation of life-sustaining resources such as the water cycle or air quality. Nature-based solutions utilize the functions of the natural environment to address community vulnerabilities while providing quality of life improvements known as co-benefits. Specifically, they can be used not only to enhance resiliency, but also key issues such as environmental justice. The purpose of this presentation is to communicate how ecosystem service valuation can be used to make the economic case for the implementation of nature-based solutions, specifically to increase community adaptability. Once we've reviewed what ecosystems are, where they come from, and why they're relevant to community resilience, I'll provide real-world project examples of our past work. Next slide, please. So who is Earth Economics? So Earth Economics is a nonprofit 501c3 ecological economics firm. Primarily, we're sort of a research institution, and we pretty much provide technical assistance to those in need. We were founded in 1998, and we were based out of Tacoma, Washington. We're a small team of ecological economists, and we help communities, businesses, tribes, government agencies take nature into account by providing data and analyses to support improved decision making. We do this through raising awareness, conducting place-based analyses, and recommending policy and funding for more resilient, sustainable, and equitable communities. Our expertise identifies, quantifies, and values ecosystem goods and services that nature provides to people. For over 2 decades, we've worked to ensure that the value of natural capital and nature-based solutions is at the front end of decision making. We place great emphasis on environmental equity. We aim to work towards a world in which access and benefits provided by nature is not determined by race, ethnicity, class, or personal beliefs. Equitable access to nature's benefit is both a human right and a responsibility to preserve nature for current and future generations. The equitable distribution of the benefits provided by nature is key for communities to support clean air, water, soil, physical and mental health, and resiliency from the impacts of extreme heat and other natural disasters that are commonplace and often exacerbated by climate change. This is best reflected in our community-based organizations program, which is generously funded by the Kresge Foundation, where we are pro bono technical assistance providers. We provide a range of deliverables, including fact sheets, reports, talking points, and capacity building workshops to support them. We strive to offer support in a manner that reflects community needs and timelines, and our approach to partnership is informed by community-based participatory research principles. Essentially, what we try to do is provide the narrative, the quantitative, and the dollar values associated with the impact of a project so that they can, the community can be empowered and voice in their own way and advocate for the development of their community in a way that suits their needs. Next slide, please. So now we'll kind of dive into more of the technical stuff in terms of where our ecosystem service is coming from. So the term natural capital is used a lot. Nature is frequently missing from the decision-making frameworks, or it's fully not considered in ways that other types of capital are, such as buildings or stormwater infrastructure. Capital buildings and things along these lines are, economic in nature, whereas nature is not. And so they relatively get left out of that conversation because they're not comparable in that way. Natural capital refers to all the natural resources or assets that provide benefits to human in the form of ecosystem services. For example, wetlands, forests, or coral reefs. Incorporating natural capital values into our processes offers an opportunity to better consider nature in all solutions. The most effective sustainable solutions fully consider all types of capital, not just physical economic capital. Next slide, please. So now, what are ecosystem services specifically? Ecosystem services are the direct and indirect benefits that humans receive from nature. So it's kind of that linkage between the environment and what we get from the environment. They are essential to human survival, breathable air, drinkable water, nourishable food, and disaster mitigation are prime examples. There are benefits. Their benefits are like other economic benefits typically valued in the economy, such as buildings and infrastructure, but are not considered in decision-making processes. When ecosystem services are lost or improved, we can measure the economic impacts through various methodologies, such as avoided cost or willingness to pay. With ecological economics, dollar values can be assigned to natural resources and the services that result from their natural processes based on human values and markets. Next slide, please. These services are typically organized into 4 broad categories, including provisioning, regulating, supporting, and information services. A common framework to categorize the ecosystem services provided by nature is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. I'll spend a little time here just to provide some examples of ecosystem services, but if you want to take a deeper dive, this framework is freely available online. You can see that regulating sources are kind of the biophysical means that provide a clean environment, such as air quality, water quality, things along those lines. Provisioning is more so like the extraction of resources, so timberlands, things along those lines. Supporting services such as habitat enable the other types of life forms to survive in terms of providing habitable places to live, essentially. And then information such as cultural or aesthetic values as well. Next slide, please. So ecosystem services can be valued. These are services not bought or sold in traditional economic markets, and as such are commonly assumed to have no value. This leads to inefficient decision-making and the degradation of life-sustaining resources. However, these services can be economically valued based on their impact on people. The process is known as ecosystem service valuation. Typically, this process involves quantifying the biophysical contribution to humans. For example, how much clean water is going to be supplied, or how many air pollutants are going to be removed in each year. Once the change in the provision of goods is quantified, we must determine how this impacts human well-being. For example, when 1 ton of air pollutants, such as particulate matter, are removed, how does this impact the risk of people developing chronic diseases or requiring medical attention? After that change in human well-being has been quantified, it can be economically valued through various methodologies. In this case, the avoided cost approach can be used by estimating the cost of a typical hospitalization or a change in life expectancy, and then that dollar value can then be applied to that quantity. The EPA provides key economic indicators to represent the social costs associated with specific pollutants, and these values can be combined with that biophysical impact, which is the amount of pollutant removed, to actually value the ecosystem service of the provision of clean air. Next slide, please. So here's the type of resiliency projects. Once again, I won't spend much time here as Shannon went over some of this material at the beginning, but these ecosystem services can be specifically utilized to address specific community vulnerabilities, such as flood risk, for example. These strategies are known as nature-based solutions. So basically, when you mimic the natural environment for a specific purpose within a human context, that is considered a nature-based solution in our understanding of the definition. Other approaches can be used to equally mitigate disasters, such as traditional gray infrastructure, such as dams or levees. But I think it's necessary to make the linkage here between the nature, what's being provided in terms of the ecosystem services, and how that goes makes its way to human impact, social impact. So next slide. So why nature-based solutions? So both green and gray infrastructure strategies can be used to equally mitigate risk, but the key distinction is that nature-based solutions provide co-benefits. These co-benefits, such as the provision of clean air or the beautification of urban areas, improve the quality of life for surrounding residents. Through these co-benefits, project impacts can be maximized while increasing overall community resilience. Nature-based solutions are an effective multi-purpose strategy to improve resilience and the quality of life of people. Next slide, please. So why do we value? Biophysical units cannot be easily compared to other project benefits that are communicated in terms of dollar values. Ecosystem service valuation converts the impact of ecosystem services on well-being into dollar values, which allows them to be equally compared across project benefits. This is what we call apples to apples comparison. The valuation of ecosystem services can also communicate the magnitude of importance of specific features or resources, or in other terms, it can be used to highlight human preferences for different environmental features or services. For example, it can be used to communicate how important recreational opportunities are for different groups of people, or identify how individuals would like to address specific community vulnerabilities. At the end of the day, what ecosystem service valuation does is communicate how humans benefit from the environment and then placing a dollar value on that impact. In turn, this allows them to be integrated within traditional decision-making processes and support more sustainable and equitable communities. Next slide, please. So the uses of ESV, how have they typically been used in the past? Ecosystem service valuations can be used to raise awareness of environmental challenges faced by communities. For example, the absence of urban greenery can be linked to an increased exposure to extreme heat. This can have significant impact on communities and even result in loss of life. Using ecosystem service valuation, we can estimate how tree canopy cover can regulate these temperatures and begin addressing climate vulnerabilities. They also can show how projects increase the quality of life within funding applications. Ecosystem service valuations can be used to show how a project maximizes public benefits and creates the economic case for funding. Recent updates to federal policies, such as the guidance provided by OMB A4, have begun to provide rules and regulations on how ecosystem services should be integrated within federal environmental analyses. This is a key step towards making more informed decisions and support the development of sustainable communities. These changes in federal policy have set the precedent that ecosystem services must be included when deciding where investments and what investments should be made. This provides an opportunity for communities to utilize ecosystem service valuation to make the case for investment for nature-based solutions. Ecosystem service valuation can be used to report on the impacts of investment. Often organizations want to or are required to report on the results of their investment. For example, private institutions are beginning to track their environmental impacts so they can begin to offset them. More commonly, though, community-based organizations and non-government organizations invest in community development of environmental conservation and want to show the importance of their work. Often they can apply ecosystem service valuation to communicate how their work has impacted people and the environment and create that narrative for that economic case. They can even be used to inform sustainable development or management of communities and resources. Let's say that a community is facing stormwater control issues. The prevalence of impervious surfaces within urban environments increases the amount of runoff and the speed at which it enters drainage systems. The community could decide to build traditional controls such as gray infrastructure, or they could estimate the required level of bioretention or their nature-based solutions to accomplish the same goals. Commonly, it's most appropriate to take advantage of the strengths of both strategies and pursue a hybrid approach. Ecosystem service valuation can be used to highlight the strengths of nature-based solutions and help determine which strategies would be appropriate in different contexts. Next slide, please. So how does this tie into equity? Ecosystem service valuations can be used to raise awareness of or report on progress addressing specific environmental inequities. For example, if a community faces significant pollution created by historical siting of specific industries or land uses, then creating barriers of greenery can help mitigate the impact of air pollution. And that's where ecosystem services can help report on those impacts. Furthermore, ecosystem service valuation can be combined with mapping exercises to identify populations that will benefit from ecosystem services. This is known as beneficiary mapping. We're still developing methods to more accurately map beneficiaries. Challenges include modeling how ecosystem services will perpetuate through the environment. In the case of water quality, we know that projects can improve local water qualities, but issues arise when attempting to project or estimate how far downstream these impacts will flow. The map to the right is an example of how we're attempting to improve how equity is integrated within our ecosystem service valuations. This map shows statistically significant clusters of census tracts that display either high or low social vulnerability as estimated by the Social Vulnerability Index within New York City. With this context, we highlighted that the South Bronx is significantly more vulnerable than other census tracts within New York City. By providing ecosystem services within these communities, we can begin addressing some of the challenges they face. Maps like these can be used to advocate for increased community investments in areas that need it the most. Next slide. And now we're getting into more so of real world projects that we've worked on in the past. So the South Bronx Unite is a community-based organization in New York City, specifically located in the South Bronx. They wanted to raise the awareness about some of the public benefits associated with their waterfront development plan, which was aimed at addressing disadvantaged communities and environmental inequities. This project aimed to support vulnerable communities. Waterwise Gulf South is another community-based organization located in New Orleans. Their community continually faces stormwater flooding. They use green stormwater infrastructure to control and slow urban runoff and mitigate the impacts of flooding. They use ecosystem service valuation to make the case for implementation of more green stormwater controls and help plan a sustainable development of their community. So once again, it is a community-led visioning process, and we're giving them the tools essentially to give them a voice and advocate for what they want to see happen in their community. Green Compass is a sustainable stormwater infrastructure developer in Washington, D.C., whose aim it is to mitigate combined sewer overflows. Using the valuation of the co-benefits associated with green infrastructure, it was their goal to advocate for increased rates on stormwater credits that are accomplished through green infrastructure. Through this, they hoped that it would increase the implementation of nature-based solutions for stormwater control. Finally, ESVs, or ecosystem service values, are utilized by FEMA, specifically within their benefit cost analysis toolkit, which utilizes ecosystem service values to select projects that will not only mitigate the risk of natural disasters, but also maximize public benefits. So once again, it's taking into account the hazard mitigation, which is their primary focus, but then also they want to address the social and economic well-being of communities as well, and that can be reflected through ecosystem service valuation. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the South Bronx Unite fact sheet. This project was created through a community visioning process and aimed to increase community resilience and address environmental justice concerns. The South Bronx has less than half of the total acres of greenery per 1,000 residents when compared to the New York City average. They are also subjected to significant levels of pollution created by the inappropriate siting of power plants, trucking distribution centers, and waste facilities. As such, the impacts of this caused significant rates of asthma within the community, and it led to this area being referred to as Asthma Alley. due to the disproportionate prevalence of asthma within that community. The project would construct 17.6 new acres of park, a little over 7.5 acres of green stormwater infrastructure, 6 miles of trails and recreational opportunities, and also provide access to their previously inaccessible waterfront, which is also a key cultural resource for these communities. In total, we estimated that the project will provide over $250 million in social, environmental, and economic benefits each year. The project is also estimated to provide 540 direct construction jobs and 1,000 indirect jobs within related industries. Overall, this project will reduce the impacts of unexpected events and natural disasters while strengthening the community and increasing their ability to adapt to ever-changing conditions such as those projected by climate change. Our work has helped report on these impacts of their investments, and through that, we hope that it will help support the case for similar projects in the future. Next slide, please. And here's an image from our Green Compass report, which communicates the value of the green stormwater features. They implemented various stormwater controls such as bioretention or infiltration trenches, just as an example. We found that across their 7 developed sites in Washington, D.C., the ecosystem services equated to be about $17 million in benefits across the entire project lifetime. The project lifetime was projected to be 12 years, which was when the operation and maintenance funding would cease. Through this benefit cost analysis, we found that this is equal to returning $7.70 for every dollar invested. Through this work, Green Compass hopes that investment in sustainable stormwater development will increase. Our ecosystem service valuation was used to make the economic case to increase the payments for avoided runoff credits. As a developer, Green Compass can use these credits to offset some of their development costs. They believe that the co-benefits of nature-based solutions should be incorporated in order to make nature-based solutions more attractive to developers and create sustainable communities. Next slide. So those were just a few examples of how our partners have utilized ecosystem service values. There are plenty of examples within our publications archive on our website. If you have any questions regarding ecosystem service values, please feel free to reach out to me directly. If we go to the next slide, it'll have my email address there, so feel free to reach out. And it's our hope that raising awareness of ecosystem service valuation and beneficiary mapping will increase the equitable construction and distribution of urban green infrastructure. Thank you for your time, and it was a joy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Carson. That was really informative. Okay, so we have a few more additional resources slides to share with you all before we get into the Q&A. And I noticed that a lot of people have been sharing questions. I really appreciate that. And we'll do our best to get to them. Just a few notes very quickly. So we have a couple of additional resources to share with you. One is the Equity Guide for Green Stormwater Infrastructure Practitioners. If today got you feeling a little bit more excited and interested in deep diving equity in green stormwater infrastructure practices, this is a really thorough guide from our colleagues at the Green Infrastructure Leadership Exchange and Greenprint Partners. This guide is relevant for anyone implementing or advocating for green infrastructure. And the guide follows a very logical process, but you can jump in at any section that's relevant to you. So the link to that guide is down in that green box at the bottom of the screen. You'll be able to get access to that link if you don't have time to write it down. We'll have the PDF of these slides will be available in the handouts tab of your GoToWebinar panel. This is a report from Carson's organization, Earth Economics, in partnership with WaterWise Gulf South. So that was that New Orleans-based community green infrastructure organization that he was talking about. So if you would like a little bit more, a more specific example of what equitable green infrastructure can look like, this is a really great and thorough, I would say, case study style report. I would highly recommend checking this one out as well. And then I also just wanted to make sure that everyone's aware that the Southwest Environmental Finance Center hosts the Integrated Asset Management Framework. It's intended for utilities and planners and municipalities. as a method for blending green and traditional gray asset management. And if you're not sure what asset management is, you can check it out on our website. It's a big part of what we teach in practice at the Southwest EFC, and it addresses the question of what happens to a green asset once it's installed, and also how to plan for green assets alongside gray assets. We also incorporated into that website is the Green Asset Resource Database. It houses a list of green assets, example photos, general costs for installation and maintenance, and other relevant information. So you can check out that resource as well. All right, so at this point, we have time to address some questions from the audience. I'm going to field these questions, and I'm going to call on Carson and or Dany to step in and answer. You can feel free, audience members, to keep entering questions. If we don't have time to get to them now, one of us will follow up with you via email. So Dany and Carson, if the two of you wouldn't mind, go ahead and turn on your video again and unmute yourself, and I will send some questions your way. So let's see here. All right, so we have a question for Dany. Dany, has your organization, Anthropocene Alliance, had experience with regulatory and permitting, I'm guessing, requirements for these projects? And if so, is this a big challenge, especially for community organizations?
That's a great question. And I think as a younger org is something that we're just starting to get some experience with. So most of our projects, I think, are still in the early stages of capacity building and community, like gaining community support and doing the engineering and design. I would say, though, in our limited experience with addressing regulatory and permitting concerns for a project, it's definitely a challenge for community organizations. I think, especially with green infrastructure, the challenge that we're seeing is that unless the community organization owns the land that they're trying to implement an intervention in, it makes it really hard to go through the permitting processes to get that project implemented. So that's where, you know, having those partnerships with either the landowners, or if the city is the owner of the land, having those partnerships with the city or the landowners is super important to smooth out that process. But yes, I would say it's definitely a challenge for community organizations, and one that we're trying to kind of brainstorm ways to address. Thank you for that question.
Okay, thanks so much, Dany. A question for Carson. What SLR projection do these analyses utilize? And I'm guessing maybe you can speak to what that acronym is referencing here as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. I believe they're referring to sea level rise and projections associated with climate change. Typically, you know, this is a highly debated topic anyways, in terms of which model is the most appropriate to use. You know, some say 7 meters of sea level rise by 2050, some say maybe a foot or less, depending on where you're at, right? So not only is it locationally specific, but also which modeling technique is most appropriate. You know, it's because it's so highly debated, we'll work with our partners to kind of figure out, you know, the context of this project, and also this context for the stakeholders. In our experience, stakeholders will also have a kind of a steering factor, not necessarily steering, but just it will impact how you're going to frame this analysis, right? So if you have, you know, different state legislators, maybe they would want to use their local state government's projections for sea level rise, whereas maybe others would prefer a different model. So, you know, we work with our partners to figure out what they prefer. We go and look into it, determine if it's, I guess, not feasible, but reliably accurate in terms of our analytical rigor, because, you know, we have a very big awareness of greenwashing and things along those lines. So we really take steps into precautionary steps to avoid that. So whatever we put out there, we have to put our stamp of approval on. And so with all those considerations, it really makes it difficult to say which specific projection we'll use. So the short answer is it depends, and it's for all those reasons. So great question though.
Yeah, really great question. Thanks for elaborating on that. So I also have a kind of a more basic question that I think Dany can probably field. What is capacity building?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think capacity building has become kind of one of those buzzwords that everyone's just throwing around. So I think we think of capacity building as kind of building the skills and the skills, the capabilities, the knowledge of our organizations to be able to better address the challenges that they're dealing with and to better respond to the opportunities that arise. So, for example, one of the things that we're working towards in our capacity building efforts is building like grant writing portfolios. So it's like basic information that each community-based organization can quickly access to include in a grant grant application, to just be able to more quickly apply for and hopefully access that grant opportunity. So yeah, just anything that kind of builds your organization's or an individual's ability to respond and access resources and solve their issues.
Great, thanks for that. I also just want to, this is not a specific question, but there's been a bit of a sub chat going on in the audience, especially from a few communities in New Mexico regarding post-wildfire impacts and the effects that burn scars can have on flooding in communities and water quality and these kinds of issues. And this I think could be a question for either Carson or Dany. Have either of you worked with communities that in a post-wildfire context, and how might you address these concerns from the perspectives or standpoints of your organization and your experience?
Dany, would you like to go first? Because we have worked in wildfire before, but I'll defer to you.
Yeah, we haven't worked too much in wildfires. I have a there was a question I think related to that about does the Forest Service have native trees? I can talk about that, but Carson, if you want to respond to kind of just more generally first, and then we can get into the details.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've done a couple of wildfire analyses. Like I said, we're rooted in ecosystem service valuation, and that can be applied to natural capital, such as forests. And so we have done a couple post-fire analyses that focus on the ecosystem services lost not only from the fire, but then also the environmental costs afterwards, like you were saying, in terms of increased runoff because now there's no vegetation, turbidity issues, erosion, all these things. So we can place environmental values on that and to show that cost, not just the economic cost, but like the true cost of a fire. And because, you know, everything is buzzwords, right? So they just want to throw out like it was $1 billion fire, but that's, you know, home values, right? Necessarily that natural capital cost. So it's also important to, you know, take that into account and also to figure out how to manage these things. So that's how we've approached it. It is doable, and it is a concern that's more appropriate now more than ever, seeing the increase recently. So it's a work that is relatively, I guess, not new, but newer. But yes, ecosystem service valuation can be integrated into those approaches to make the case for best management practices, such as fire break, things along those lines. Even home hardening, there's a projected or proposed project that we're potentially going to work on, where it's looking at the environmental contributions of home hardening. So investment in home hardening, and what does that do for other industries that are connected and also within that community, whether it be a state or county. So there's lots of different angles that you can take at this, but those are just a few examples that I have.
I would add to that, I guess, from A2's perspective and some of our members, we have members that are that represent tribal communities. So I think it's really important to not leave out of the conversation the traditional ecological knowledge that can be leveraged as more of like a preventative tool. So partnering with your local tribes and trying to integrate their knowledge into management practices, I think is extremely important. And as far as the resources question, so whether the Forest Service has native trees. I'm not sure exactly if that's a resource that the U.S. Forest Service provides, but A2 is partnering with the River Network to be a regranting organization for the Urban Community Forestry Program. So we will have an RFP, a request for proposals, coming out pretty soon for urban, or not, I don't think it's necessarily urban, it's just community forestry program. So I believe that can be applied for kind of restoration type projects, but I'm happy to get more details about that if that is of interest.
Great, thank you both for those really thorough answers. So there's another question that came in, I think, as a part of that chat question that we posted earlier, in regards to what is the biggest environmental justice issue that communities are facing. And someone responded, stormwater seems to come faster and deeper than before. And in terms of small cities and in mountainous environments, how would you help to address flooding in the low areas surrounded by the mountains? So working specifically within that geographical context, do you have any sort of general recommendations of places that communities can get started there?
Yeah, it's a little tougher when you're in the upper watershed like that, because there isn't a lot of time to slow that water down before it's hitting your community. Green infrastructure, in my understanding, really slows that process and tries to retain it. But if there's nowhere for it to buffer or to retain it, then it's a little bit more difficult. I know from just my experience living in Washington State, a lot of our upper watershed communities in the Cascade Mountains, they receive regular riverine flooding all the time. They rely significantly on levees. And so it's trying to find that balance in between. It's kind of a newer area, so I'm not quite sure. We provide a lot of analyses for urban contexts, but to the extent of which nature-based solutions are applicable there, I'm not quite sure. I know that logging practices maybe could be something to look into. Clear cutting can, really rapidly increase that runoff going into the rivers. And so that's an ecosystem service value in its own, which you can try to value. The difficulties there is, once again, the hydrological modeling, right? So figuring out the before and after a project in terms of water and what that means for the floodplain and the flood zone and flood depths. Once you have that figured out, then it's relatively easy to assign economic values in terms of like percent of buildings lost and things along those lines. But the other aspect of nature-based solutions as well is the connectivity of nature-based solutions. So, having nature-based solutions all along the river rather than just one area will make a magnitude difference. Green infrastructure tends to be, I guess, less efficient in terms of its footprint compared to its impact, compared to green infrastructure in terms of you put up a levee in, say, 500 feet, and you're going to instantly solve that flooding issue. Whereas you need extensive more amounts of green infrastructure to lower those water levels, essentially. So those are kind of the pros and cons in that context. Hopefully that was helpful, though.
The only thing I can really add is I think just the importance of incorporating like hazard management and like disaster response into your green infrastructure development, because green infrastructure can only do so much. And so inviting your hazard planners or mitigation planners into those conversations, I think, is really important. I would say an example of a really impressive recovery and response effort that has been coupled with some green infrastructure was the town of Lyons in Colorado. They were hit with a really devastating storm in 2011, and just the process of recovery and the amount of material that they developed to share with other communities that are facing similar challenges, I think, is really impressive. So we'd definitely look into what other people are doing as well.
Great. I have one question in response to what Carson, something that Carson said, which mentioned, which is hydrological modeling as part of the ecological system evaluation process. We as a TA organization at Southwest EFC have gotten some requests in the past for services helping with hydrological modeling. Do either both of you know any organizations that will offer hydrological modeling as part of your TA services?
I'll defer to Dany on this one because we were talking about working together for that exact reason. So go ahead, Dany.
Yeah, I think we worked a lot with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for hydrological modeling in the Silver Jackets program, which aims to provide those kind of like typically really expensive technical assistance to underserved communities. So I would say that's definitely one. I think we're trying to build also a repertoire for the agencies and partners that can provide that kind of technical support, but definitely U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is a good place to start.
Yeah, and in our experience, you know, that is usually the major barrier for our work as well, because it is so expensive and it is very specialized. You know, we're economists, not really ecological modelers in that sense. And so they're just data intensive, quite complicated, all those things, right? You know, we have tried to partner with engineering firms before, but because of that high price, it's hard to use our pro bono funds to for that cause. And so you really utilizing those government programs for technical assistance is really key there, especially for frontline communities.
Yeah. All right, really great points. And I think at this point we're about at slightly over time. So I want to release our participants to go on with their day. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. If you had any questions that we didn't address, we're going to be more thoroughly going over those questions after the webinar, and we can follow up with you in an email response. Here's an overview of our webinar schedule. We're going to be doing these quarterly. So right now registration is open for the next 3 webinars in the series. You can also go ahead and sign up for email updates at the link that Joni dropped in the chat. It's the efcnnetwork.org/training events page. And each webinar will be recorded, so you can watch either the live or recorded versions. And these recordings are going to be posted to the event page for each webinar and will also be available on the EFCN YouTube channel. If you're based in Albuquerque, you can stay tuned for 2 in-person workshops that are going to specifically focus on building partnerships to implement green infrastructure. These dates are also to be determined, but we are loosely planning for spring of 2025 for part 1 and spring of 2026 for part 2. And this is just one last slide to remind you to complete the survey when this webinar ends so that you can let us know your thoughts on today's session. Because this is a series, we're aiming to improve every time we do this, and your feedback is absolutely essential to that goal. Huge thank you to Dany Garcia Moreno and Carson Risner for sharing their expertise with us today. Following this webinar, you're going to receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording, as well as a certificate within a week. If you want us to get in touch about this or other webinars in the series, please feel free to reach out to me at my Southwest EFC email address. I'm at spepper@unm.edu. So thank you again, and I hope to see you at the next webinar in our series. It will be Navigating the Green Infrastructure Policy Landscape. That's coming up October 10th, and registration is now open. We hope to see you all there.